Welcome to Lore Tours, this is your captain speaking, and today we're setting our destination on somewhere that's not for the faint of heart. We're venturing into the darkest corners of the Halo universe, to a place where nightmares come to life and civilizations crumble. Please fasten your seatbelts and brace yourselves, for what we're about to come face to face with is a force so chilling, so destructive. It's left entire galaxies trembling in its wake. This entity, this Parasite, is known only as the Flood, a life form that knows no boundaries, respects no laws of nature, and consumes everything in its path. But try not to worry, we'll be sure to keep a safe distance. After all, we wouldn't want any of you becoming part of the Flood's next meal, would we? So hold on tight, keep your wits about you, and prepare for a journey like no other. This is one lore tour that's going to get under your skin. Quite literally. Let's embark on this chilling lore tour into the heart of the Flood. To truly understand the Flood and their insatiable, cruel hunger, we must first venture back billions of years to a time of long-forgotten myth and legend, to a time when the galaxy was led by an impossibly advanced species of aliens known as the Precursors, shape-shifting beings who explored many galaxies and seeded them with life over the course of billions of years as part of a grand experiment. And as part of this experiment, the Precursors held to a belief known as the Mantle of Responsibility, believing that they, as the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and holders of the mantle, must take guardianship of the galaxy, and all the life they had created within it. As time passed, one of the Precursors' child species stood out as a beacon of advanced civilization, the Forerunners. Originally created by the Precursors to serve as their assistants and adjudicants, the Forerunners were set to inherit the Mantle of Responsibility from the Precursors. However, these ancient beings, in all their wisdom, would later deem the Forerunners unworthy of the role, and instead give the mantle to humanity's ancient ancestors. These ancient humans were larger, stronger, and more intelligent than modern humans, and had built up a vast interstellar empire that rivaled that of the Forerunners. Enraged by this perceived slight, and fueled by a disputed belief that the Precursors were planning to eradicate them, the Forerunners betrayed their makers, and launched a campaign of extermination against the Precursors, pursuing them across the Milky Way to the satellite galaxy of Parthkafona. A few Precursors escaped or were spared by the Forerunners, either going into suspended animation or transforming themselves into a strange molecular dust that was meant to wait out the war and eventually regenerate into their past forms. This regeneration was not to be, however, as both the dust and the automated ships adrift in space that contain the dust both became defective, leaving what was believed to be one Precursor left active in the galaxy. This Primordial, as he would come to be known, would then, consumed by an insatiable hunger for revenge, manage to transmute itself into a form that could survive millions of years, allowing it the time to seek out righteous vengeance on the Forerunners. And the Primordial's plan for vengeance would begin with ancient humanity and their Sanshyam allies, stumbling across the abandoned Precursor ships, carrying the defective and corrupted dust that once made up members of the Precursor species, unaware of its true origin, but amazed by the array of beautiful patterns and colours that this dust would bring about when applied to the coats of pets, notably one human pet breed known as the Feru. Humanity spread the dust far and wide throughout its empire, unaware that by doing so, they were bringing about their own doom. Around the same time, humanity discovered a small planet on the edge of the Milky Way system, and within it lay a stasis capsule containing the Primordial. This capsule was taken back to humanity's world of Charam Hakor, and the Primordial was placed in a Shanshyam developed time lock, allowing the humans to attempt to open a dialogue with the creature. After many years of attempts, the Primordial eventually began to open up to humanity's probing. Its responses, however, would shine a light on the horrors to come, as on worlds across the human empire, the dust of the once Precursors began to have strange effects on those exposed to it. The Feru's aesthetically pleasant modifications, caused by the dust, began to morph both the body and minds of the creatures, making them violently attack and devour anything they came across. This strange phenomena wasn't just limited to the Feru, however, as what became known as the Shaping Sickness eventually started to take form in humans, virulently spreading and dramatically altering their behaviour before sending entire worlds into chaos. Men, women, and children afflicted by the dust began devouring each other, and sought to spread the disease to those unaffected by it. The afflicted then moved on to cannibalism and sacrificed the infected, inducing a sacrificial individual to grow them in size, then forcing uninfected individuals to consume the infected being whilst they were still alive. At this point, the flood infestation, which had previously been predominantly a mind and behaviour-altering affliction, with only relatively minor physical changes, began to reshape its victims into a variety of forms designed to gather victims, engage in combat, and to rapidly consume useful biomass and other resources. And the sickness was capable of doing so thanks to the resilient and adaptable flood supercells, a mysterious type of cell that makes up all flood biomass. As a parasitic life form, the flood spreads itself by infecting a host's body with a sufficient quantity of these supercells, either through airborne exposure to flood spores, or more direct and horrific means which we'll discuss later. Once enough of these cells have breached a host's body, the cells analyze the genetic code of their host to determine how the body will best serve the flood. Then they begin gnawing away at the host's body, particularly its calcium reserves, seeking to build up flood biomass and convert the host's original form into one more beneficial to the flood. As the cells travel through the host body, they target the nervous system and the cerebral tissue, taking control of it, turning the being into new flesh puppets for the flood, and assimilating the host's thoughts and memories into the flood's collective consciousness, of which the host is now a part of. The infected hosts then, in most cases, lose their consciousness and are driven by a primal urge to assault and assimilate other species. This process only takes a matter of seconds and can be conducted on both living and deceased hosts, as long as the bodies are not fully decomposed. With the flood infecting and expanding at a rapid rate, the worlds of the ancient human civilization began to fall. In desperation, facing a corrupting and insidious threat, the humans resorted to desperate measures, aggressively expanding and invading alien worlds to replace those lost to the flood and strengthen their control over swathes of the galaxy. Humanity adopted a scorched earth policy against the flood, sterilizing any planet that showed the signs of flood infestation, even those occupied by non-human races. And eventually, humans believed they had found a solution to the flood. A third of humanity would have to be sacrificed, using them to infect the flood itself with a destructive set of programmed genes. This, followed by continued military strikes and orbital bombardments, eventually seemed to have turned the tide of the war against the flood in humanity's favour. That was until the flood appeared on many minor Forerunner worlds, and in an effort to halt the flood's continuing spread, human fleets began destroying flood-infested Forerunner ships and cleansing Forerunner planets where flood infestations were detected. Doubting the true threat of the flood, the Forerunners became outraged by these assaults and humanity's perceived aggressive expansion, and this outrage would boil over into a war between the Forerunners and the human Sanshyam Alliance. Now fighting a war on two fronts, humanity would eventually suffer a decisive defeat in the war against the Forerunners, the toll of years of struggle against the flood proving too much for these ancient humans. With their empire in ruins, humanity was devolved by the Forerunners into a primitive state and left on their homeworld of Earth. During the final years of the war, the flood had seemed to retreat back into the darkest edges of the galaxy, leading the Forerunners to believe that humanity had developed a cure to the parasite. This was, however, a trick devised by the flood to divert Forerunner resources in search of a cure, and lead them into a false sense of security, as the Forerunners would soon realize when the flood finally returned, and were met by the Forerunners headlong in a terrible and unprecedented war that lasted 3 centuries. Due in part to the Forerunners underestimating the threat posed and allowing the flood time to become deadlier and more intelligent, the Forerunners were not as effective at combating the Flood as the now defeated and evolved humans, with one particular example of this being the multiple instances where their lack of preparedness and ruthlessness allowed the Flood stowed aboard unarmed civilian transports to bypass orbital defense fleets and overwhelm the planetary defenders below, while the ships above watched on in terror as they were forced to sterilize the planet they were defending but a few hours before. And during the war, countless worlds belonging to all species experienced the true terror of Flood infestations on their homeworlds, with most Flood infestations going through 3 distinct stages, known as stages of deluge, with the Parasite growing exponentially more intelligent as it gains access to more biomass, technology, and knowledge. And the first of these stages is known as the feral stage, in which the few sources of Flood on a planet act as little more than instinctual predators, aggressively hunting down sentient life forms to harvest their biomass and cerebral tissue. This feral stage is usually initiated in 2 main ways: through infiltration of non-Flood ships or the deployment of Flood forms from orbit via dispersal pods, or alternatively the infection of various sentient and non-sentient species by Flood spores that have made their way onto or were already present on a world. These Flood spores are airborne collections of Flood supercells that, when inhaled by a host, begin converting the host's body into Flood biomass, eventually converting the still-living host into a series of egg-like incubators that birth larger infection forms. Among these infection forms are the airborne swarms of cedar infectors and the waterborne tadpoles, but the most common of all is the pod infector, creatures that, while small and weak, can scuttle towards their prey in large swarms, ready to overwhelm them. Upon reaching their prey, these beings use their short, tentacled legs and fleshy tendrils to tear into the individual, burrowing into the host's spine, where the infector then rewrites the host's neural pathways, giving it full control over its new host body. From here, the Flood then burrows further into the chest cavity and spews out large numbers of Flood supercells. This helps convert the host biomass into new Flood biomass, and at this point the host is then turned into a new form, something more useful for the Flood's goals, and these are either the combat form or the carrier form. Combat forms are cruel mockeries of the host's original form, with the Flood converting much of the host's original body into bulging and pulsating Flood biomass, yet retaining many of the host's sensory organs and limbs, allowing the new form to use weapons, tools, and even ships. The worst part of this all, however, is sometimes if you listen carefully, you can still hear whimpers and cries of pain coming from the individual, leading us to believe that the host might still be sentient, kept alive by the very parasite that has taken control of their body, fully aware of the horrible acts being perpetrated by their body, but unable to do anything about it. One of the more common types of these combat forms seen swarming around the galaxy was the attacker form, which were the morphed forms of the galaxy's sentient and intelligent species. And the true body horror of these creatures is best seen in the human attacker form, where the pod infectors, upon burrowing into their victim's chest, then push the host's head back to make room for the pod infector to sprout out its sensory feelers, creating a truly skin-crawling sight. And this process of infecting sentient life is similar for many other species throughout the galaxy, erupting from the abdomens and orifices of grunts, brutes, elites, and just about anything that could be turned into an effective foot soldier. During this initial feral stage, Flood infection forms will also begin to target certain non-fully sentient species, those deemed intelligent enough and useful enough to be converted into their own unique combat forms. Freshers is the name given to the variety of hulking, vicious Flood forms formed when the Flood encounters a large, powerful creature, such as primates. They use their immense size, toothy maws, and barbed tentacles to fiercely defend their territory. Swarm forms are the result of the Flood infecting predatory flying creatures, which then launch coordinated swarm attacks on targets from the air. And bombers were another airborne Flood form that was formed from the alien cephalopods that travelled the air via large gas bladders, This form got its name thanks to its ability to incubate and drop pod infectors from above onto enemies, and if any of these combat forms were to suffer some kind of damage that limits their combat potential, the Flood would transform the being into a carrier form. Large, bloated creatures whose sole purpose is to incubate and transport new infection forms. As these forms spread out on a world, cementing their control and harvesting sufficient quantities of biomass, the Parasite can establish layers for defense and the growth of specialist forms. These layers are usually little more than repurposed areas already present on a world, for the Flood does not need to build when it can simply infest and corrupt existing areas instead. Around the same time as forming a hive, the local Flood infestation has usually also gathered enough bodies and minds to rise up from a purely instinctual form, and use the harvested intelligence and memories housed in the neural tissue of their prey to become a sentient collective consciousness, merging large numbers of Flood forms, corpses, and living beings who contain knowledge valuable to the Flood into a seething giant mass of Flood biomass to create a viable mind capable of controlling and coordinating localized Flood forms, all the way from the smallest Flood supercell to the largest combat form, communicating with and controlling all via a mysterious form of telepathy, originating from the concept of neural physics, a form of scientific study practiced by the ancient precursors that was so complex it would have appeared to be magic, even to the Forerunners. Essentially, it's the idea that all matter, anywhere in the universe, is interconnected and alive at a fundamental level. The precursors were able to use neural physics to create incredible technologies, including practically indestructible ships and structures, as well as star roads, gigantic tendrils that stretched across interstellar distances and could be used to move across vast distances. And the Flood, as a creation of the precursors, was able to utilize the advanced concepts of neural physics for their own benefit. As this rudimentary Flood mind, this proto-grave mind, continues to grow and accumulate more biomass, it eventually evolves into a fully fledged grave mind, a near-omniscient Flood form made from the minds and bodies of thousands of hosts. Many grave minds can exist in a galaxy at one time, each acting as a local command point through which the collective Flood consciousness can exert its control over the Flood in that area. Essentially, each grave mind and the forces under their control are all part of the same consciousness, the Flood hive mind that has been active since the time of the primordial. And with the arrival of the grave mind comes the coordinated stage of the Flood infestation, in which local Flood forces become vastly more lethal and coordinated in their behaviour. And at this point, the infested world itself begins to show more visible signs of corruption, with swathes of Flood biomass covering the planet's once thriving population centres. Great spore towers reach into the sky, spewing immense numbers of Flood spores into the atmosphere of the planet. With much of the planet now converted into Flood biomass and a lack of host to infect, the Flood begins to form new pure Flood forms, made of biomass, and no longer limited to the bodily forms of a host. These pure forms can take on limitless numbers of appearances, all designed to adapt to certain challenges. This is best seen in the Shifter, an iteration of pure Flood that transitions between three unique configurations during combat. The first of these is the Stalker, a highly mobile being that can quickly traverse terrain, even on vertical surfaces. Once the Stalker configuration comes across an enemy, it usually transforms into either the Range configuration, which is a large pod-like creature that fixes itself to a vantage point and fires down sharp calcified spikes, or they may alternatively transform into the Tank, a hulking brutish configuration with long scythe-like arms designed for frontal assaults. There are also a number of other pure forms utilised by the Flood for specialised tasks, including the Gaunts, elite assassins that use their whip-like arms to traverse the environment and capture key enemies, absorbing their knowledge and intellect to aid the Flood's goals. The Infestors are utilised by the Flood to seek out enemy armour and bore into it, ready to release Flood spores onto the vehicle's inhabitants, while the Spawners are mobile brood sacs prowling the lands of the Flood's newly conquered territory, spewing out infection forms to solidify their control of an area. And perhaps one of the most terrifying Flood forms of all is the Hellion, gargantuan mobile hives that are sent to besiege the most stalwart of planetary resistance, tearing into fortifications with their vast, ever-changing forms, and dropping freshly incubated flood onto their prey from above. Assisting in the coordination of the flood forces during these closing phases of the flood infestation are a number of elite beings known as key-mind warforms, essentially acting as field commanders. These forms are created by fusing multiple captured sentient entities together with pure flood supercells, in a similar manner to the proto-gravemind. Unlike the proto-gravemind, however, these beings are mobile and assigned specific missions when sent out into the combat zones to command local forces. The first of these warforms is the Juggernaut, a tentacled beast that uses the combined minds of its carefully selected hosts to outwit enemy countermeasures and adjust the combat strategy of local flood accordingly. Abominations are gigantic key-mind warforms that bring order and direction to lesser flood in the field. These towering nightmares are used when the standard flood hives cannot be established, and the flood must stay mobile to avoid destruction. Unlike the Juggernaut, however, that prefers to avoid combat, the Abomination thrives in it, and is a formidable opponent capable of decimating fortifications and mechanized defenses. And our last key-mind warform is the Blight Stalker. These terrifying quadrupedal hunters appear once a world has been completely overrun by the flood. At this point, the planet has been completely terraformed into a new biome, one more fitting of the flood, known as Blightlands. These Blightlands are characterized by an increased temperature across the planet and uncontained flood biomass, devouring the soil and native vegetation. The Blight Stalkers scour this new biome in search of elusive sources of biomass and intelligence, hunting down anyone that may have survived the flood's initial invasion with a speed and power that dwarfs even that of other flood forms. With a gravemind fully established and the planet under control of the flood, the Parasite will then begin to leverage all the technology and information it has gathered to spread the flood off-world, whether that's by utilizing existing transports from their newly conquered world, transforming them into nightmarish mobile hive ships that will then be crashed upon new worlds, or by turning to the ancient star roads of the precursors. A flood infestation is by no means limited to just one world, as the Forerunners would come to realize in their war against the flood, with vast regions of space falling to the Parasite. Referred to as burns by the Forerunners, these sections were deemed unrecoverable, and retreating Forerunner fleets were resigned to sterilizing countless worlds within these regions, melting their continents to molten slag and boiling their oceans. These measures were not enough, however, so out of desperation, the Forerunners turned to strategies and technologies previously thought too barbaric to use against living beings, extensively researching hard light and plasma weaponry that could completely disintegrate both the flood and those in its path, as to not leave any biomass for the flood to devour. The sterilization of worlds eventually became the sterilization of whole star systems, with the Forerunners forcing stars into early supernova as part of their own scorched earth policy. Dangerous and flood-resistant species such as the seething Phanologolo and the towering Sharkoi were deployed in small numbers to flood hives in an attempt to burn them to the ground. However, the erraticness of these beings led to them being replaced in the waning years of the war by large numbers of machine soldiers such as the Sentinels. The predictable nature of these robot soldiers was easily exploited by the flood, however, leading to the shameful act of transferring Forerunner and human essences into these machines. And while this was effective, this innovation came too late in the war, so in a final throw of the dice in this battle against the flood, the Forerunners turned to the Halo Array, a collection of 7 massive ringworlds measuring 10,000 kilometers in diameter, designed to emit a series of overlapping harmonic frequency pulses that would eradicate all sentient life throughout the galaxy, destroying both the flood and its food source. During the testing of one of these rings in the Charam-Hakor system, the blast freed the captive primordial contained there. Intrigued by the discovery of the primordial, the being was taken by the Forerunners for study aboard one of the ringworlds. Its interrogation was entrusted to Mendicant Bias, a Forerunner AI construct that had been given full authority over the Forerunners' defenses against the flood. Over time, the Primordial opened up to the prodding of mendicant bias, but only to turn and twist its jailer's own questions, testing the AI's logic and loyalty. After 43 years, the creature eventually broke the shackles of the AI's artificial mind, using a technique that would come to be known as the Logic Plague, utilizing the Flood's combined immense intelligence to philosophically corrupt and compel mendicant bias towards its own purposes against the Forerunners. Fully corrupted by the Logic Plague, mendicant bias, the very intelligence responsible for the Forerunners' defense against the Flood, turned against its creators just as they had against the precursors. Mendicant bias then launched a strike at the Forerunners' capital with the Halo weapon network, effectively severing the head of Forerunner power before seizing one of the ringworlds and narrowly escaping. As the Forerunners reeled from their loss of leadership, the Flood surged onto millions of worlds. Yet despite being pressed on all sides, the Forerunner military managed to retake the rogue Halo ring, capturing mendicant bias and the Primordial in the process. Now in the possession of their greatest enemy, the Forerunners interrogated the captive Primordial. The answers they received, however, were vague and mocking. Enraged, the Isodidact activated the reverse stasis chamber containing the Primordial, forcing an artificial process of decay, equivalent to 1 billion years, to transpire over several seconds. Despite its physical body breaking down in the stasis chamber, the Primordial's consciousness survived this fate, transferring itself into the memories of the Flood compound intelligence, becoming synonymous with the multiple grave mines that would sprout up around the galaxy in the years to come. With the Forerunners leaderless and in chaos, the Flood spread throughout the galaxy exponentially. Much of the galaxy was now deemed part of the burn-designated sectors. Areas formerly filled with wonderfully diverse life were now seething beds of infestation. Believing the war all but lost, the Forerunners fled to the extragalactic Ark, the gargantuan foundry responsible for the construction of the Halo ringworlds. And here they solemnly activated the weapon network, destroying the Flood and all other sentient life throughout the galaxy. In the years that followed the activation of the array, the few Forerunners who survived repopulated the galaxy with the species that had been decimated by Halo, having safely preserved specimens of each species upon their ringworlds. They also prepared a number of heavily secured installations, including sites on the ringworlds themselves, that continued research on the Parasite, hoping that one day a cure would be discovered. When their work was finished, these Forerunners, done with meddling with the affairs of others, fled the galaxy in exile, leaving behind only traces of their civilization in powerful machines and facilities which remained on numerous worlds. 100 millennia later, inspired by these very same curious artifacts and facilities, the Covenant was created, a religious alliance of various species that mistook the Halo rings as keys to spiritual transcendence. And during their attempt to transcend by activating the Halo array, the Covenant stumbled upon humanity, an encounter which resulted in a war lasting 3 decades. This conflict came to a head on one of the Halo rings, when the Covenant inadvertently released a flood from one of the Forerunners' containment sites, suddenly imperiling the galaxy once more, and forcing humanity to destroy the installation. Elsewhere in the galaxy, on the ringworld Delta Halo, the Flood had breached their Forerunner-imposed containment and engaged in a 100,000-year battle against the Sentinels of Delta Halo that had been assigned to contain the Parasite. This would eventually lead to the formation of a grave mine aboard the ring. Following the arrival of Covenant and UNSC forces on Delta Halo, the Gravemind began to plot its escape and expansion, converting the UNSC ship named In Amber Clad to a plague ship, and slipspace jumping it inside of the Covenant's space station homeworld, High Charity, where the Flood spewed forth from the UNSC ship and began consuming the various districts of High Charity, turning the once great space station into a vast plague ship. However, after discovering an ancient Forerunner portal complex beneath Earth's surface, the Covenant had set in motion a plan to activate Halo from the Ark, threatening to end the Gravemind's new freedom almost as soon as it had begun. In desperation and rage, the Gravemind and its Flood forces intercepted its foes at the Great Foundry. Working alongside humanity, the Parasite managed to stop the Covenant's efforts to activate Halo before it was too late, showing a willingness amongst the Flood to temporarily cooperate or debate with sapient creatures in order to achieve a goal. The Flood, however, do have just one singular goal: the infection and transformation of all life in the galaxy into an undifferentiated mass of biomatter, with every sentient being consumed and absorbed into the grave mind. As the humans discovered, the Flood cannot be reasoned with, swayed by threats, or manipulated. And as the Flood turned on their brief alliance with humanity, the humans were forced to activate an unfinished ring that could eradicate the local infestation and stop the Flood yet again, though without endangering the galaxy as a whole this time. While this act did catastrophically damage the Ark, and scoured the Parasite from the surface for a time, the threat of the Flood was not yet averted. Hidden within the devastated remains of High Charity, crashed on the Ark, a vestige of the Flood still festered in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by the dim-witted Jiralhanai brothers Pavium and Vordius, who recklessly deactivated the Ark's sentinel defences that were keeping the Flood at bay, resulting in a bitter battle between the combined Banished and Sentinel forces versus the Flood forms spewing forth from High Charity. And although the battle ended with the Flood once again contained in a sealed-off High Charity, the Parasite is still there, waiting for its next opportunity to break free, and who knows what other corners of the galaxy this despicable seething mass of hatred is hiding in, ready to pounce. Without question, the Flood represents the greatest threat to biodiversity in the galaxy. Whether it was right for the Forerunners to have exacted galaxy-spanning genocide in order to save future generations may be debated, yet such luxuries now only exist because of Halo. At present, the Parasite has been kept at bay, but it's uncertain how long this will remain. And that, dear passengers, concludes our journey into the chilling depths of the Flood. We'll now be leaving behind the haunting echoes of the Flood's insatiable hunger for the safety of the Lortor's interdimensional spaceport, and not a second too soon if you ask me. I'd like to thank you all for choosing to fly with Lortors today. We know you have many other great options available, so we appreciate you choosing to fly with us. Make sure to leave your thoughts on the Flood down below in the comments, and make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on our next flight. This is Captain Rick signing off. Thanks for flying, catch you next time.